People always talk about the downside of racism. There's an upside too. The upside is that nobody thinks you're smart. They don't even know why they don't think you're smart. Don't woke them, let them sleep. Just go ahead and do the deal you have to do. Racism offers great business opportunities if you keep your mouth shut.
Bert Williams combined the grace of a Charlie Chaplin, imagery and all, and at the same time with a very rich voice too. And so he was wonderful comedy.
He has a song where he's obviously explaining to his wife who the woman was that he was seen with. And the refrain chorus line is, "She was a cousin of mine." He has that line, I would say, 6 or 7 times in the song. She was just a cousin of mine. Every time it's different. Every time it's a new interpretation. The man was a genius.
In the earliest years of the 20th century, Bert Williams was the most successful black performer on the American stage. But each night he performed behind a mask he hated, blackface.
Bert Williams didn't want to black up. But socially during that time, he had to. And he realized that he's a very intelligent man. We have to hide our identity by putting on this mask in order to get things said and done. But we did it. We did it. And today we don't have to do it. But we cannot forget it.
Traditionally, it was white actors who wore blackface in skits that ridiculed black people and black life.
Ladies and gentlemen.
How do you like them?
They're very nice, but what's remarkable about them?
Well, I chose you.
Why, Pussyfoot, I thought your wife always picked your clothes.
No, only the pockets. Get it up!
Minstrelsy actually was the first vehicle that condoned the appropriation of African-American expressive forms. Thomas Daddy Rice, a song and dance man, sees an old crippled African-American, as legend goes, someplace in Ohio, dancing on the street in a very strange and angular and maybe syncopated way. Wheel about, jump just so. And every time I do this, I jump Jim Crow. Daddy Rice is then in some other town, sees another African-American moving in an interesting way, gets the incredibly innovative idea to wear this man's clothes, blacks up with burnt cork so that no one will miss his drift, and comes out and is this huge hit.
Minstrelsy is still here. Its ghost is here, which makes it more dangerous because it seems to be invisible, and it's not. The younger generations, of course, don't know anything about it, and it's only come out of the closet recently. We're beginning to study it again because we were ashamed of it for so long. Black people didn't want to hear it, and white people were guilty about it.
Minstrel stereotypes emerged in the early 1800s and gained in popularity through the Civil War and after. With few venues open to them, black actors, too, became minstrels.
Black minstrelsy had its own agenda, and you see it change as it comes toward the end of the century. First of all, blacks advertised themselves as authentic, and this drove white minstrelsy into vaudeville, into specialty acts.
Bert Williams was tall and light-skinned, a native of the West Indies, who dreamed of performing on the legitimate stage.
He ends up in San Francisco, and there's a guy there named George Walker, and he says, you know, if you want to get a job, you're going to have to black up.
George Walker was a minstrel performer from Lawrence, Kansas, whose dark skin made blacking up unnecessary. Like Williams, he was in his early 20s and hungry for success. They formed a team and toured for 2 frustrating years until Williams finally tried blackface. Billing themselves as 2 real coons, they were a hit.
The Negro musical was the rage of New York. Slapstick comedy skits about chicken thieves, candies, razor bites, and flannel shirts were in vogue, along with ragtime music. And, well, we appeared in them all in blackface.
Nobody was more surprised than I was when it went like a house on fire. Then I began to find myself. It was not until I was able to see myself as another person that my sense of humor developed. Bert Williams.
The one thing that African-American males also did was, in inhabiting that stereotype, they actually modified and inflected it because, of course, under that black mask was their real black selves.
Williams and Walker fused minstrelsy with vaudeville and set it all to the syncopated rhythms of ragtime and the cakewalk.
It's cakewalk time.
The cakewalk began as a plantation dance by the enslaved African Americans who were mimicking and ridiculing the highfalutin manners of the master. Of course, the master didn't know he was being ridiculed. And interestingly enough, the cakewalk becomes this dance fever fad that sweeps across America, black and white. It's the first American fad dance.
Ragtime and the cakewalk set the beat for America's entry into an age of electric lighting, automobiles, and silent films. Williams and Walker became celebrities, starring on the white vaudeville circuit and creating their own ragtime musicals.
They took the old minstrel forms, but they were able now to write their own shows. And the audiences still expected the old business, but what Williams and Walker did was, one, they had double messages. If there were black people in the audience, you understood something and white people didn't. And 2, they began to change the form, the characters, the stereotypes.
When I was born, my mama's friends combined names they tried. They named me after Papa. And that same day, Papa died.
Among Williams' characters was the Jonah Man, an everyman down on his luck.
The man with the real sense of humor is the man who can put himself in the spectator's place and laugh at his own misfortunes. That is what I am called upon to do every day. Bert Williams.
The real challenge of black art has been how to speak candidly and truthfully about the human condition from the vantage point of black people without being preoccupied with approval, recognition, and acknowledgement of the white mainstream. And this is a very, very difficult dilemma.
I think black artists at their best live in the moment
in a way that is constantly able to take that moment and show it in a way that we haven't seen it before.
In 1902, Williams and Walker teamed up with some of the most accomplished African-American composers and writers of their day to create an ambitious new musical. They hoped it would land them at the heart of the American theater, in New York City, on Broadway.
The way we aimed for Broadway and just missed it in the past 7 years would make you cry. We'd get near enough to hear the Broadway audience applaud sometimes, but it was someone else they were applauding. I used to be so tempted to beg for a $15 job in a chorus just for 1 week, so as to be able to say I'd been on Broadway once. Bert Williams.
In Dahomey is about African Americans going to Africa, to Dahomey. It's the kingdom of Dahomey. And it's, you know, these musicals don't have any white people in them. I mean, it's about African Americans and for whites and African Americans, but it's a sense of autonomy there that was never experienced before.
In Dahomey was an expensive gamble for its white vaudeville backers, involving elaborate scenery changes and a cast and crew of 50. It was the first full-length black musical ever to be produced for Broadway.
Williams and Walker produced and starred in Dahomey in 1903. What they must have gone through back then, they were really pioneers. To mount a show that makes it to a place like Broadway is finding the right script, a script that the producer believes in to the innermost depths of his being, that he believes it's going to pay his investors back, it's going to last on Broadway, it's not going to get there and close.
In Dahomey opened in February 1903 at the New York Theater. The best seats in the house were reserved for white patrons. Blacks were sent to the 3 upper balconies. The lights dimmed, and the cast won the audience over.
To be on Broadway in a hit show is magic. It's what you work for all your life. And then you arrive there, and you're on the boards.
You came to New York to be on Broadway. The streets you've been walking up and down for years, looking for work, asking for work, and enduring the no's, or you're not right, or you're never right, or whatever, suddenly disappear. You belong.
After 53 performances, the cast and crew of In Dahomey boarded the SS Urania, bound for a tour of England and Scotland. Bert Williams was now an international star.
He was interviewed there. They said, "What's it like being a black man in America?" He said, "Being a black man is wonderful." He said, "'Cause that's what I am." He said, "But in America, it's an inconvenience."
In 1896, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld segregation. African Americans were equal citizens by law, but they could be kept separate in the nation's schools, public meeting places, and halls of entertainment. In this time of hardship, a new sound emerged. It would be embraced as America's music and come to define freedom.
Jazz is equated with democracy in this country. You have the freedom, the possibility to pursue something that you want to pursue. It exists for you, that possibility.
Born along the Mississippi River, jazz took root in the growing city of New Orleans. The music was built on rhythms as old as Africa, on the spirituals and work songs of slavery, and on the waltzes, quadrilles, and marches of New Orleans Spanish, French, and American settlers.
The thing about New Orleans is just such a culturally rich town, and on any given day, any given time of the day, you might hear parades just to hear the sound of that bass drum. You look out the window and you see the people dancing in umbrellas and guys wearing streamers dancing, having a ball. That level of enthusiasm and exuberance resounded throughout the community.
Thank God for New Orleans, because if it had happened in Virginia, we'd all been in trouble. Because in 1692, they took the drums away to try to break the culture up because they thought it was communication. But New Orleans was the perfect place. Jazz could only have been born there.
Jazz filled New Orleans dance halls and gin joints and spilled out into the streets in the parade rhythms of New Orleans brass bands.
And these people who invented jazz were working people. Some of them were laborers, some were cigar makers, and they came from all walks of life. That music was played with a lot of soul and a lot of rhythm. And they were deeply soulful, and they believed in it, and that's what they loved.
Most of the early musicians couldn't read music. They picked it up by ear, and now they started to embellish it a little bit, ornament it, change a few notes here and there. And in this sort of embryonic fashion, developed something which we then later called improvisation.
The New Orleans style of jazz really is a sound of collective improvisation, a choir effect, which brings together a front line of usually a cornet or a trumpet, a clarinet and a trombone, and then a rhythm section to give that dance pulse that the dancers need.
Boom, 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 it's like a conversation between the bass drum and the snare drum, and it's the use of a shuffle, and the shuffle is ding 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 doom boom boom boom.
And they had to learn how to bend those conservatory-trained instruments into that vocal expression and that rhythmic influence of the Africans. And the combination, the hybrid, is what made it a music that transcends everything.
The king of New Orleans brass in 1900 was a young cornet player named Charles Buddy Bolden. Bolden's music was never recorded, but it was legendary, even while he was alive.
Supposedly, when Bolden would come out of his house, he'd start playing, and the sound that he had was so majestic and great that people would just come from blocks around just to hear him play, and he would organize them, and, they'd march down the street, and just that element of celebration was introduced to our music.
Bolden was probably the first one to really draw on the blues, combine it up with what was being called ragtime at the time, although ragtime in New Orleans had its own set of characteristics that really set it apart. They didn't use the word jazz. They called it ragtime or ratty music or gut bucket music, hot music.
Take, for example, Buddy Bolden's blues. If you can picture people dancing, so to say, polishing their belt buckles to a piece like this.
Jazz gave voice to a generation, white as well as black, eager to embrace change.
Jazz is a musical expression that embodies the spirit of America. The level of freedom that you have within the form of the music, that everyone has their own voice, and together they can work to produce one thing that is so great.
Although many in the white community disapproved of the music and the way it mixed the races, brass bands were in demand at civic clubs, debutante balls, and college dances.
This notion that everyday people can produce an art as refined as the upper classes and the bourgeoisie, which is a democratic notion, actually, was hard for people to accept.
The New Orleans social establishment, the elite, in other words, did their best to ignore what was going on. It's an era of segregation. There's no way of getting around that. Racial oppression was a fact of life in New Orleans at the turn of the century. Jazz, like most American vernacular culture, percolates up from the bottom of society, doesn't trickle down, in other words. And what was happening in the streets, what was happening in the neighborhoods, is something they just didn't want to deal with.
Hardest to ignore was Storyville, a 38-block district created by New Orleans aldermen to contain houses of gambling and prostitution.
Storyville is the birthplace of jazz is really too simplistic. The fact is that jazz was pervasive to New Orleans neighborhoods. Storyville, however, was an interesting focal point, first of all, because it was unique as a kind of pseudo-legal red light district, and because it attracted the sporting life people, which would be gamblers and pimps and stars of the stage. It was the equivalent of a jet set for its time at the turn of the century.
There were pianists who were known as professors who would perform there. These places were outlets for them to have steady work and employment. And they were called professors because they were educated in music. They understood music theory as well as they were teachers.
One of the most popular professors in 1900 was a teenager named Ferdinand Joseph Lement, better known as Jelly Roll Morton.
Jelly Roll Morton was quite a colorful figure in New Orleans history. He was a great New Orleans pianist. He was a tailor. He was a pimp. I mean, he was very, very widespread in his interests, and he laid a lot of the groundwork and introduced a lot of the fundamental concepts of jazz. The trumpet player and allegedly the first jazz musician, Buddy Bolden, had probably the most impact on Jelly Roll Morton than everybody else. Buddy Bolden took a lot of the ragtime elements, and by ragtime we really mean syncopation as an agenda in music. And Buddy Bolden took that sound and used it to organize the community in parades and funeral ceremonies and other events around the community.
Buddy Bolden lived like he played, fast and hard. In 1907, at the age of about 31, he suffered a breakdown and was committed to a hospital for the insane, where he died.
This created a vacuum at the top, so to speak, and other trumpet players like Freddie Keppard or Joe Oliver had an opportunity to really put themselves forward at this time.
In Bolden's absence, a new generation of musicians would take the lead. A generation farther removed from slavery and more impatient for change. Their music offered evidence of black achievement as it introduced new and unanticipated controversy. Williams and Walker returned from Europe triumphant. They reopened in Dahomey in New York before embarking on a 2-year tour of the United States. Their show earned a 400% profit. Free to create new and bigger musicals, the team now faced growing criticism for their continued use of minstrel stereotypes.
To be a progressive black person at the beginning of the century was to consider the meaning of your success and its impact on race. Many people took the posture that our job was to lift the race, to defend the race, to put forward the best view of it, and to make our lives the wedges that would open a larger space for those who came behind us.
Is it not possible that while you hold the old plantation Negro, the ludicrous darky, and the scheming grafter up to entertain people, you could likewise have a prominent character, representative of superior ability, mentally, morally, and physically? Professor Albert Ross.
I think the artists Williams and Walker were extremely aware of a sense of responsibility to the community, of how they were being projected to the community, of how their art was being interpreted by the community, and that there was a general sense of uneasiness about the coon songs and this whole coon song era.
Williams and Walker defended themselves, arguing that they employed large numbers of African Americans. They said that they were working to change negative images, but were limited by the expectations of their audiences, white and black.
These men were heroes. They were not cowards. They were heroes to undergo what they had to live through in order to be able to keep a roof over their head and bread on the table. And they managed to do this with an incredible amount of élan, talent, ingenuity.
Over the next few years, the team created a string of popular musicals. They had been partners for more than 15 years when George Walker collapsed on stage in 1909. He died 2 years later.
After his partner died and the Williams and Walker shows came to an end, he went on into the Ziegfeld Follies and played for, I don't know, almost 10 years, I guess, before he died. And he played solo performer, and then once he was recognized as being so wonderful, he was integrated into the show itself.
The Ziegfeld Follies were famous for their lavish productions and beautiful chorus girls. Bert Williams was the only African American in the cast and the highest paid black performer in America. He performed in blackface.
When Bert Williams joined the Ziegfeld Follies, what he had to give up was a sort of freedom that he had. He would leave Broadway and travel back uptown, lonely, go to a little bar, and then there he would joke with the black customers and keep his comedy sharp. But what he gave up, of course, in exchange for money, was autonomy.
Bert Williams was performing on stage with some of the great performers of the time. W.C. Fields, Will Rogers, Fanny Bryce, Eddie Cantor, who became his friend. But he was not treated with the respect off stage which he deserved.
I reached the conclusion last spring that I could best represent my race by doing pioneer work. It was far better to have joined a large white show than to have starred in a colored show, considering conditions. When I became a member of the Follies, I well knew that my success would be due to the tact I displayed. Bert Williams.
The piece that I do on Bert is taken from a real incident that happened. And he has a frock coat, top hat. He talks about how he misses George Walker, who's passed away, and now he's by himself. And then the stage manager says, Mr. Williams, it's time. So he says, I'll be back. And he goes out and he performs for these people.
Why, it's the good ship Robert E. Lee, and it's coming! The whistles are blowing, some folks that's a showing, ropes at the throwing to the place we all going to the good ship Robert E. Lee. Oh, get on board, see them shuffle along.
He recreates the Cakewalk, which they were famous for. He'd do the Cakewalk. And then afterwards, he could big up the end and wham, and he finishes the number, and then the audience applauds, and he gets up and he goes, oh, you just touched me so much. Oh, you're so wonderful. I tell you what, tonight the drink's on me. That's right. I'm buying everybody a drink. Bartender.
Say what? Oh, no, man. I say, I'm buying. Yeah. No, sir. These here, well, these my friends. What? Yeah, I know, but... Oh, is that right? No, sir, that's quite all right, sir. I'll just forget small place sometimes. Yeah, sir.
And he looks at the audience. He looks up at the bartender. He looks back at the audience. He goes to his dressing room. He's sitting there.
Well, sure was a good house tonight. Happy people. I sure love me some happy folk. Yeah.
He starts taking off the blackface. He looks up at he sees his skin. He looks down, he looks at the black makeup. He looks back at the mirror, and he sings,
I ain't never done nothing to nobody. And you know something? I ain't never ever got nothing to see for nobody, no time. But you know, until I can get me something, hold on to it. Right here in my little bitty arms, I say, Lord God, this is mine. Oh, I ain't gonna do nothing for nobody.
As voices of African-American protest intensified over the first 2 decades of this century, white resistance also escalated. In New Orleans, jazz musicians responded with a new assertiveness, an edge that demanded that they not only be heard, but recognized. By 1908, a new leader was emerging, a 21-year-old from rural Laplace, Louisiana, Edward Kid Orry.
Kid Orry was the first jazz trombonist of any consequence, and he was probably the inventor of what we call the tailgate style of trombone playing, which is really nothing more than what the trombone plays in the collective improvisational music of New Orleans. And they called it tailgate because usually the trombone, because the slide goes out, he had to sit at the end of the wagon so he wouldn't poke all the other players.
They often played in a tailgate wagon to advertise. They would give it their all with that good, mad music they had under their belts. Kid Orry played a little tune on his trombone that made the crowd go wild. Louis Armstrong.
Orry was of French, Spanish, and African descent, an elite group in New Orleans known as Creole, and classified under Jim Crow laws as Negro. In his music, Orry defined himself on his own terms.
A jazz musician wants to have his own signature because that's what makes him unique. Everyone has been influenced by someone. There will always be an indication of who you've been listening to.
After you have that identity, you have the responsibility of making sure that that identity works with other people's identity. It's really a very delicate thing, and that's why it's very difficult to play jazz.
He was the most advanced trombonist of the time, the most skilled, the most talented, and therefore he played a significant leadership role. He led many brass bands.
And between 1908 and 1919, when he left for California, he built what is arguably the most important dance band in New Orleans in this period.
The New Orleans sound had been on the move since Kid Orry arrived in the city. It was carried out by the growing numbers of black Southerners who followed the Mississippi River north toward opportunity.
One of the first really great jazz bands to leave New Orleans was the original Creole Orchestra, and the star of that band was a trumpet player named Freddie Keppard. And in 1916, the Victor Talking Machine Company offered Freddie Keppard a recording contract or an opportunity to make a single. And he refused, and basically his reason was, why should I give up my style?
He was afraid that somebody was going to copy his stuff, so to speak. Just as some trumpet players played with handkerchiefs over their fingers so that people couldn't figure out what they were doing, fingering-wise.
And of course he was dead right about that, because phonograph records is one of the ways in which young people learned how to play in a jazz style.
In 1917, another New Orleans group accepted Victor's recording offer, the original Dixieland Jazz Band. The all-white band had been making a name for itself on the New York club scene.
It isn't the best example of jazz. They played these sort of ragtime pieces, and they did a lot of whining and crying on their instruments and imitating barnyard animals and all kinds of hokum stuff.
What amazed everybody is that it sold somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,500,000 copies in its first 6 months of release, which definitely got the attention of musicians back home in New Orleans.
They made much more money, the original Dixieland band, than any of the New Orleans guys did. Jelly Roll Morton, any of those guys. That was one of the things that frustrated Jelly Roll Morton when he used to say, I invented jazz and these guys stole it from me. That was what he was talking about.
By the fall of 1917, jazz was on its way to France. The United States had entered the First World War. Nearly 400,000 African Americans enlisted, including members of New York's 15th Infantry Regiment, whose military band was led by Lieutenant James Reese Europe.
Jim Europe was one of the most famous of the African American band leaders who really organized the New York scene on behalf of black musicians in the period leading into World War I.
Europe's regiment faced intense fire in the trenches of France. Their bravery earned them the French Croix de Guerre and a new nickname, the Hellfighters. In August, their military band was called to Paris.
Jim Europe, with his band, played in France, both for the population there and for all kinds of military festivities.
What was to be our only concert was in the Theatre des Champs-Élysées. Before we had played 2 numbers, the audience went wild. We had conquered Paris. James Reese Europe.
They made such an impact in France and in other places that it just spread all over the continent.
And particularly in France. France was always fascinated with, at that time, le nègre, the Negro. And they were always well received.
Jazz had carried the troops to war, and jazz brought them home as they marched in victory up Fifth Avenue in New York City in February 1919. African Americans anticipated new freedom in the nation that they had offered their lives to defend. Yet the road ahead would be long and troubled. In 1915, a motion picture had been released that claimed to tell the real history of the American South in the years after the Civil War. It was called The Nation.
When I first saw Birth, they wanted to kill black people in this film. They thought killing black people were the strong, vital, threatening enemy. It was not like black people were just coons or clowns. They were the national enemy.
I was furious. I get a shaky feeling in my stomach. This is a movie that led to the reincarnation almost of the Ku Klux Klan. the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan.
The Birth of a Nation was America's first full-length commercial movie, a high-budget 3-hour epic. The film's appearance in theaters sparked an outpouring of black protest and prompted a group of civic leaders to produce The Birth of a Race. The film was a collection of biblical and historical images intended to be racially uplifting. It failed at the box office.
Birth of a Race failed because it did not have one vision behind it. It was people who were not filmmakers trying to make it through a committee.
The film industry was changing rapidly as storefront Nickelodeons gave way to grand movie houses. A few powerful studios bought out the competition and established themselves in Hollywood, California.
Black people saw the film industry as being against us. And there were no possibilities for a black to make films as a director behind the camera at all. And so not only that, but it was a film industry that was reflecting the racism of the time, so that it was just not possible to show a black person as a human being. If you did that, everybody would say, "What are you thinking about?"
In response, African Americans created their own film companies. One of the earliest was started by Noble Johnson, an actor, and his brother, George.
George and Noble P. Johnson were from Omaha, Nebraska, and they originally started the Lincoln Motion Picture Company, and they were among the sort of premier filmmakers making all-black cast films, and they made several films that were quite popular.
In 1918, the Johnsons' search for African-American stories led them to The Homesteader, a novel by a black entrepreneur from South Dakota named Oscar Micheaux.
First, he was a rancher and a farmer. He wanted to build a grand empire. He wanted to be the first black man to own 1,000 acres. That's an empire, you know, big. When that collapsed, he says, well, I'll write about my effort to do that.
The Homesteader included a controversial romance between a black man and a woman who is believed to be white. The Johnsons wanted to cut that story, but Micheaux insisted on it and demanded to direct the film.
He has this marvelous way of saying, people do these things, I can do them too. I don't need to be trained to be a filmmaker. I don't need to be trained to be a novelist. I'll just do it. I don't need to be trained to be a farmer. He was a great American dreamer.
One of the greatest tasks of my life has been to convince a certain class of my racial acquaintances that a colored man can be anything. Oscar Micheaux.
When negotiations with the Johnsons broke off, Micheaux raised money to shoot the film himself.
He was the P.T. Barnum of movies because he could find a way to make people interested who maybe were not interested at all. He could always cut a corner or sell a proposition, and also always look for the controversial edge in a story that would make people take notice. He was almost a charlatan. He was so smooth. He would get white farmers who were impressed with his stamina and his drive trying to be a farmer in South Dakota. They liked him, so they invested in him. And so he would sell stock for $75 a share in his companies.
Anybody who could write a novel, then write the script, then make the film, then promote the film and distribute the film. And this was during a time period when financial resources were not readily available. This was during a time period, of course, of segregation. And this was also for a man who could not drive a car.
To get his film seen, Micheaux carried it himself from theater to theater. Black-owned theaters were few and far between. Many white-owned theaters segregated black patrons and didn't show black films.
He was making films for a black audience, but he wanted a national audience. He would try from time to time to get his films into white theaters. Now, there were almost laws. There were definitely stylistic prohibitions against showing black films to white audiences, but he would try to get around that.
Cinema, per se, is such a difficult art and to get your work done. Then when you take that and you add the racial and the gender problems to it, and then when you are going against the unconscious benign racism and not so unconscious sometimes the racism and the competitiveness, you add all those together, it makes it very, very difficult.
Unless you're trying to do an independent film that's very mainstream Hollywood, you know, very skewed to a specific genre or something, it's very difficult. It's not an easy road, and there are no guarantees.
He found early on that there was a certain economic scale he was working in. He had a limited black audience. He could never get beyond that black audience. So if he put twice the amount of money and time into a film, he would never get a return on it. He got down to a 1-to-1 ratio. One take, that's it. Little rehearsal, that's it.
With The Homesteader a commercial success, Micheaux turned his attention to an urgent new project, his response to The Birth of a Nation. He began filming in 1919, the year that the soldiers returned from war. They faced lynchings and escalating white attacks on black communities, which ignited riots in more than 25 cities and towns across the country. In Chicago, the violence claimed more than 38 lives. 6 months later, Micheaux chose Chicago as a city in which to open his new film, Within Our Gates.
Within Our Gates is several stories, but the heart of it is lynching. It's about what lynching means in America. And in many ways, I see this film as a reversal of the story of Birth of a Nation. In Birth of a Nation, you show a white woman who is being raped by a black man, and then that black man is being lynched by the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan is almost formed as an organization in history to avenge this one white girl's near rape. She's not really raped. In Within Our Gates, Micheaux shows that the rapist is a white man raping a black woman, and that the lynching ceremony is more or less a cover-up of this other national crime. So in many ways, he's rewriting history in a very fundamental way.
This was a film that was not only directed to an African-American audience, it was also directed at a white audience to make them rethink and re-examine their pre-existing views with respect to race.
And everybody was afraid that the race riot, which had recently taken place in Chicago, that all of this might start up again. But he got influential people to speak to the issue that this is a question that must be faced and must be addressed. So it was shown, but under a great deal of pressure. And the pressure was so great that Micheaux never handled a racial theme so openly again.
Continuing to work outside the Hollywood system, Oscar Micheaux made as many as 4 movies a year. In the 1920s, when sound was introduced to film, he was the nation's only commercially successful black filmmaker.
He was a hero to many black people who didn't even see his film, simply because he was doing something so unusual and so remarkable. We must never forget that aspect of Micheaux. Even today, he is remarkable, not so much because the films are wonderful or because you've seen them, but because he did something that no one had done before.
In Chicago, the New Orleans sound took root and grew. By 1925, its new king was a 25-year-old trumpet player who'd grown up in the shadow of Buddy Bolden and played in Kid Ory's band. His name was Louis Armstrong.
Armstrong had a totally different approach from the musicians who were in New Orleans before him. For instance, like his intro on West End Blues. that message right there messed people up all over the world because they had never heard the trumpet played like that, and they never would again.
The 20th century was 2 decades old, and freedom remained an elusive goal. But African Americans were lifting their voices, and their music defined freedom for the nation and the world.
Jazz became popular in this country because it came from this country. The people created the music to objectify what was going on in the country. So if it wouldn't have become popular, you'd have wondered what's wrong with them. I mean, it came from our experience. It was about the American experience.
America embraces jazz and the blues. And a new generation of African-American artists redefines freedom. When we return to I'll Make Me a World.